All right, good. So, as you said, I'm the head of academic outreach for Mendeley. Some of you may know me as Mr. Gunn from online. I tweet as Mr. Gunn, and I'm a researcher by training. So you can see a list of my papers here, not only on my Mendeley profile, but also via my ORCID ID there. One thing I'm going to do with my talk, I'll just let you know ahead of time, I have deliberately put a lot of what I think are some of the really key points not on my slides, and the reason for this is twofold. One is so that if you want to, to hear what I have to say, you need to listen, and the other is so that to encourage people to tweet or possibly to blog about what I'm saying. So pay attention because there will not be slides available. Maybe there will be. So a little bit about where I come from. Institutionally, so I come from Mendeley, and Mendeley is a startup that started about early 2008. It's a group of researchers, graduate software developers from a variety of U.S. and UK institutions, recently acquired by Elsevier earlier this year, and we have done a great deal of work since very early on in altmetrics, and I think Jason Preem and the mention of Mendeley you've seen in altmetrics sessions earlier might help drive home the point that we are really one of the preeminent providers of altmetrics kinds of data in providing data about who is reading papers across our library of over 2 million researchers. So Melinda had a couple of key questions. This is kind of how I'm going to structure my talk and focus it a little bit around this sort of point. So first, the problem that we're trying to address. So everyone has a couple of questions depending on where you're coming from in the research process. So if you're a researcher or if you're a funder, you want to know, is a researcher doing an impactful bit of research? From an institutional level, you want to know, does this institution have an impactful research program? And if you're looking for a venue to publish in, you might want to know, does this publisher do a good job at effectively disseminating my work? So there's a lot of these things that are coming around, all focused on the idea of, is the work really advancing the field in some way? But that's what the problem is, right? You can't, we don't have very good ways of measuring this. You can't look at this LED bulb over here and say this is X units of advancement, and this one over here and say it's X minus Y, right? It's really, really hard to get at that and to have these kind of numbers to judge these things. But we need numbers to avoid this guy. We like to think, as researchers, that we are not part of this ancient cult that establishes the truth of our theories by popular acclaim. We want numbers. You don't need the highest paid person's opinion to rule the day. I'd rather rely on this guy, right? And it's just a psychological fact. People like numbers. They feel very objective. They feel very solid. They feel very real, and they do have. In some cases, actual objectivity, in some cases, more the illusion of objectivity. But in any case, they're very, very useful. Of course, you have to be very careful to consider the context in which you're using these numbers, consider what you're trying to do so you don't end up like in the Sufi riddle, looking under the street light because that's where the light is, even though you lost your keys inside your house, right? This is a statistician, actually, from earlier this century who came up with this quote, and that is very, very telling because he understands these problems, yet here we are decades later, we're still struggling with this idea of letting the metrics tail wag the research dog. It's very important that we understand this fact because one of the most common bits of negative feedback you get is that oh, research isn't all about the numbers. There's, what I'm doing is really, really important. People bring up the example of Barbara McClintock and the transposon research on studying this obscure, inheritance in maize that has ended up being a very, very important genetic thing, but people didn't know about it until way, way later. The point of metrics is not to yoke people in this path and saying, you have to do this, and we're going to use these metrics to enforce this really, really narrow, rigid framework on people. The reason that we like numbers, though, is because they work. They tell us something objective about the world, right? So they are very, very important, even as we realize that they're contextual. So I think this presents an opportunity. Once we thought about the problem, we now have an opportunity to think about how can we help researchers make better decisions about the research process, where they're going to publish, how they're going to disseminate their research. And we have some answers for that. We have some unanswered questions. And as usual for many things that are early stage like this is, we have some questions that have yet to be asked. And one of the great things that I would like from the audience participation section of this is for you guys to ask some of those questions. So be thinking about them. Some of the things that we do know is that if you have a paper in Mendeley that is widely read, for example, that's, as Martin Finner said earlier, modestly correlated with the number of citations. We know, for example, that in all of these metrics, whether you're looking at page views or tweets or readers or even citations, they all come mostly at the very beginning and they fade off. We're getting better and better at getting better resolution, but we don't have any firm answer of, this metric is good for this application. Different communities are going to want metrics for different things. And we can use these to detect patterns in gaming, patterns in activity, and we can see impact on the non-citing, much larger area of the public. So those are some of the things we do know, some parts of the picture that are starting to get into focus. We do have still some very unanswered questions about, what does it mean to have, 200 tweets versus, 20 citations, for example. So if you have 200 tweets for a paper, that doesn't take anything away from the fact that the paper might have 20 citations at all. If you are a funder, you might be really interested to know that a paper has 200 tweets, because that would tell you that the work that you funded is having a very broad impact. If it only had, 20 citations or something like that, that might tell you another thing. If you're a researcher, you would be interested in kind of maybe the ratio of some of these numbers. I don't know if anyone has looked at the way things are rated online, like at Amazon. You always see in every rating system, whether it's Amazon ratings or App Store ratings or whatever, 70 or 80% of it's 5-star all the time for everything. People just like to be positive. But if you look at those ratios, then you can start to see, the differences. And that's what we're going to find with these kind of metrics, is a better way of digging into some of these things. We know that the current thing that we're using right now, that we're loading all of the work of doing all of this assessment into, is this one thing that we know only covers a small bit of impact, and that's the citation. And we know that the citations do not correlate with actual reproducibility or the ability to build on this work. The drug companies have studied this, and they've found maybe 70% of the stuff that gets published is not actually replicable for a number of reasons. Not all to do with fraud, just, they call it the file drawer problem. You publish a lot of things, and you run an experiment a bunch of times till you get one that looks good or that gave you a significant result, and you publish that because that's what your incentives are to do. So, if we have other metrics, if people can get credit and reward for sharing their data, for publishing their analysis code, these sorts of things, then we're not loading so much onto the citation, and we can pick up a lot more things, and we can get around this kind of pernicious effect that has crept into the research cycle. And we can, instead of trying to find the bad stuff, we can positively promote the behaviors we want to see, right? Heather Piwar and others have studied the effect of sharing data on citations. And we know now, with a pretty good level of certainty, that if you share your data, your paper is more likely to be cited. It's definitely more likely to be reused, and I think we're going to see that trend start to increase. The reason that we started Mendeley, what has always motivated us is this opportunity right now. So if you think of the total amount of data that's represented by the metadata of everything that's been published and what they've been cited, that's still pretty small data, right? You could download all of PubMed or Scopus or something in a day, and you can store it on a computer, right? We have an opportunity now to collect a whole lot more data. And not only do we have the opportunity, but we have the ability. Data storage, data analysis are becoming commodities. You can spin up an Amazon Web Services instance. You can bring in all this analytical power very, very easily. And so the people that are going to win in this service era, as opposed to the content monetization era, are the people who can bring in the best expertise at developing and monetizing and providing valuable services, just as with the examples of Uber and Square and some of the things that Tim O'Reilly talked about last night. So there's still tons of data that we don't collect and we don't make available about the research process. Melinda and I were talking about the actual text of the peer reviews, the dark matter of the scholarly record. You know, you could think of all of the work that is done that doesn't make it into the public record that a scientist puts out. We're digitizing that stuff. We need to do it faster. If we get more of this data, we can do a lot more cool stuff with it. It really, really struck me what Tim O'Reilly said last night about the Google Maps and the algorithm. We don't have better algorithms. We just have more data. That's kind of become a buzzword in Silicon Valley, is that more data beats better algorithms. And so the person who can collect this data and then make it open so that other folks can come up with business models and ideas for doing it is really going to be the person who wins, I think, in this whole space. Preservation obviously is a very, very important point. I've always thought the idea of, you know, if you're a scientist, you have these instruments, why aren't they streaming their data straight into a repository, you know, so that we can work on this stuff? The fact is, you know, it's really, really important, and it's a really, really big opportunity. You can't hire enough people and bring that talent in-house for you to be able to monetize all of the data that you have. If you make it available, if you make it open, you let people start playing around with it, they're going to figure out something really, really cool. They're going to take all the early risk, you know, de-risk that data for you, figure out what has market traction, and then you can do like Elsevier did with Mendeley, and you buy them, right? So that's Mendeley. That's what we've designed ourselves around, is collecting this data from the very beginning. So it's very, very important we master the context about things. And speaking of taking things out of context, Mendeley does support the declaration on researcher assessment. We think it's a good thing. So finally, to conclude, I think we need to get better at understanding how to meet researcher needs. Figure out what people want and provide that to them. A time-tested business model, it works. But you have to get the context right. You can't just take a number and use it inappropriately, use it without the context in which it comes in. And to do that, really, you need to make this data available for the community to take that and make it useful to them. You know, the clinical nurses are going to want a different indicator, a different metric than academic, you know, scientists, which is different from drug companies. You know, so if you just give them one number that fits everything, it's going to be a very, very ill-fitting thing. Give them the data, let them be flexible with it, and collect absolutely as much data as you can. Make it available, and that is how we're going to really, really move altmetrics to a point where you can credibly say, yes, I want this to be used for researcher assessment, where researchers will want to be assessed by it. Thanks very much.